Yesterday, I was reading this book, The Illustrated History of Knights and the Golden Age of Chivalry by Charles Phillips. Ran across a little line, and actually didn't take me that long to get to it, didn't make it very far, about the cult of St. George, which all of a sudden sent me down this rabbit hole of what's the cult of St. George? Let me look that up. Well, St. George, as a saint, actually has a pretty interesting story historically. Started off being a figure who's doesn't have there's not a lot of evidence about his actual existence or what he actually may have done in life. It's not really important. He came from a military background, which also at the beginning was also not very important. And his sainthood was really all about his martyrdom, the passion of the torture he's underwent, and the resurrection, in some stories, multiple resurrections that he underwent. And that was kind of it. Hey, St. George. The Byzantines began adopting figures that were called, in one of the sources I found, military saints. And I think they used quotes. I'm not sure why. In any case, the point of a military saint was, as its name might imply, these were saints who might actually help you, not just spiritually, but literally in the form of miracles on the battlefield. And St. George was one of those. And I guess he made the cut because he came from this military background. So in the beginning, he was just a guy. Sure, he was a soldier, tortured, killed, resurrected, did some amazing stuff, flew off to heaven, then kind of was gotten a hold of by the Byzantines, his story, and they said, "Oh, wait a minute, this guy is a soldier. Maybe some miracles will happen if we utilize him in the battlefield." And sure enough, at least in the stories, miracles do occur. And so his standing as this military saint, one of a few, I guess, became elevated. Then he sort of made his way, or his story made its way to England, where the military elements of his story were even more elevated. The story about him slaying a dragon became part of the myth, or the tale, if you will, the mythology. And eventually he became a patron saint of essentially the Crusades and chivalry. Now you might be thinking, well, great, Todd, thanks for the history lesson.
You're welcome.
And what the heck does this have to do with me? Well, the thing is that got me thinking about was a couple things. One, right, I'm looking through the history of the story, but in our games, we're kind of playing through the stories. So what you end up having is this, depending on which version of the story you glom onto, this character who became an icon of, let's call it, using gaming terms, fighters and or paladins. And what kind of icon he is and what he represents obviously was very much shaped by Christianity, Christendom, particularly the flavors in England in terms of the final form. But in our games, which might have some of that or none of that, or our own twistings on that, it might be fun to think about, well, who is the iconic fighter or paladin, or really whichever class in the world, and how does that shape kind of what that class is, right? We usually take paladins, that concept of paladinhood, or the lawful good fighter from the high Middle Ages, might not be a great fit for your setting. You might find that it doesn't quite fit right, but you kind of jam it in there because it's such an established trope that you kind of think, well, how can I not? But reading through the story, it just opened up for me this invitation of, hey, well, what is the icon of the questing fighter in my setting? And how does that shape what fighters aspire to? Because remember, we're not playing through the history, which is just of a guy, if there was a guy at all, and how his story was sort of shaped to fit different circumstances, starting from just being a martyr to being kind of a military saint to being this patron saint of chivalry. He didn't create chivalry. The principles became attached to him, right? This is all the history stuff. In terms of the fictional part, yeah, St. George, he's slaying dragons. The Virgin Mary ends up being his lady, who, of course, in high chivalric fashion, he loves and longs for from afar. But apparently, after his resurrection in the later stories, she arms him. And of course, he's slaying dragons, doing all the chivalric stuff. He is, obviously, he's a great knight. He is also generous. He is loyal. He is confident. All of those things come into play. He does things for the church. He's pious. He's helping old ladies across the street. He's stopping evil doers. All that kinds of stuff that is part of the high concept of chivalry. He embodied it, even though in the history of how his story came to be, he didn't invent any of those things. But we're in the fiction, so it just made me think about, well, in your setting, maybe your St. George figure is somebody totally different. with different mores or morals or just a different way of looking at that particular oath. Yeah, I think oftentimes at least the loyalty, bravery, prowess, piety sort of stuff are kind of universal. I think maybe if you're in an atheistic world,
God is
maybe the
dead.
piousness goes by the wayside. But a lot of those values we could look and say, yeah, those are good values, but they could take different shapes. A hoplite in ancient Greece, their version might be different. How they're characterized is going to be different. And that ideal, that icon that represents it, is going to be different. Maybe in your world, you'd like to have a different sort of knight. Maybe it's even not even the fact that they're not heavily armored and using horses and that kind of thing. Maybe you want to have that, but maybe you're just like, hey, I want a different flavor. So think about that icon. Now, I'm not inventing this. I know that I want to say it's 13th age had this idea of icons. For someone who may not be familiar with that stuff, just my angle is more like how do the icons relate to the archetype of that pursuit? You have this called a questing knight, a paladin, a Templar, and that is shaped by this story that kind of became attached to St. George. Well, let's go back in our games and we can think about, well, in our setting, who is the character who's shaping that pursuit? Who is the exemplar of it doesn't even have to be fighters. It could be who is the exemplar for thieves? Who is the master rogue who in turn all rogues kind of look to and say, I want to be like him. I want to be like Mike. Who is the sorcerer or wizard or magic user who is at the top of the pyramid that everyone goes, yes, I want to be like them. They could be a legendary figure. They could be a figure that's still walking around. But who are they? What do they embody? How does that shape what the class is like, what the class sees as as ideal, what are their values. Look at your core assumptions. We bring all these core assumptions into our settings and kind of jam them into fit, even though sometimes they may be imperfect. We're trying to fit the square peg in the rounded square hole, so to speak. We can if we want to. We don't have to. Take a look at those core assumptions, but not just looking at it from a mechanical aspect, but also from the fictional aspect. Well, if this is something that is good, who embodies that good story and what do they mean? And then you get some world building, you get some lore, and that lore actually has practical effects because those moral values, that code, whatever you want to call it, trickles down to any character who undertakes that class. So it's not just something that's in the background, it's also in the foreground because that idea of the code that the knights follow in medieval Europe was extremely important to them, not just in a pie in the sky sort of thing, but in their practical day to day behavior. But let me know what you think. Hopefully, that gets you fired up. Game on. Talk to you later.